50 years ago tomorrow, 3 men in spacesuits set off on the greatest scientific adventure of all time. As the astronauts of Apollo 11 headed to the moon, the women of NASA were blazing new trails on Earth.
A 4-year-old girl pressed a button in a Cambridge, Massachusetts laboratory in the mid-1960s and accidentally crashed the simulated Apollo spacecraft her mother was building the software for. Her mother stood there watching the simulation die, and instead of laughing it off, she did something almost nobody at NASA wanted her to do. 3 years later, on July 20th, 1969,
the software had to work the first time, and there was no second chance.
That decision is the only reason Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin came home from the moon alive. Her name is Margaret Hamilton. She is the woman who wrote the code that landed Apollo 11. She is the person who coined the phrase software engineering, because before her, what she did didn't have a name. And the story of what actually happened in the final 3 minutes of the lunar descent, the real story, the documented one, is more interesting than any of the conspiracy versions you've heard. This is what she actually did, and why, for decades, almost nobody outside MIT knew her name. The woman behind the stack. There is a famous photograph. You have probably seen it without knowing what you were looking at. A young woman in a long dress with shoulder-length hair stands in a corridor next to a stack of paper that is taller than she is. The stack reaches her temples. The papers are bound in volumes, lined up neatly, and there are dozens of them. That stack is the source code for the Apollo guidance system, every line of it, printed out, all in one place, photographed in 1969. The woman standing next to it is Margaret Hamilton, and she led the team that wrote it. Margaret Elaine Heafield was born in Powley, Indiana, on August 17, 1936. Her father was a poet and a philosopher. Her mother had attended Earlham College, a small Quaker school in Indiana that prized independent thinking. Hamilton followed her there. She graduated in 1958 with a degree in mathematics and a minor in philosophy. She did not plan to make history. She wanted to be a math professor. She married a law student named James Hamilton and moved with him to Boston so he could finish his degree at Harvard. She needed work. She took a job at MIT writing software, which in 1959 was not yet a respected profession. There were no software degrees. There were no software departments. There were not even agreed-upon practices for how to write code that worked. Her first real assignment was at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory on a project called SAGE, the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, an early air defense system designed to detect Soviet bombers. The work was famously brutal. New programmers were hassled, given problems senior engineers couldn't solve, expected to fail. Hamilton did not fail. She solved the problems, she got noticed. In 1961, MIT's Instrumentation Laboratory signed a contract with NASA to build the guidance computer for the Apollo program. Hamilton learned about the project in 1965 and asked to join. She was the first programmer hired for Apollo at MIT. She would eventually direct the entire software engineering division. The team would grow to 400 people. She would be responsible for every line of onboard flight software for both the command module and the lunar module, the 2 spacecraft that would actually carry men to the moon and bring them back. She was 33 years old on the day of the landing. She had been doing this work for less than a decade, and the entire structure of how we now think about writing reliable software, the principles that keep airplanes in the air and hospitals running and power grids stable, came out of what she and her team learned doing it the first time. The daughter at the console. Hamilton brought her young daughter Lauren to work sometimes. Nights, weekends, the times when a single mother in 1968 had no other option. The instrumentation laboratory was a serious place full of serious equipment, but Lauren was 4 years old, and rooms full of buttons are interesting when you are 4. One afternoon, while Hamilton was running a simulation of a lunar mission, Lauren wandered over to the console and started pressing keys. Within seconds, the simulated spacecraft crashed. What had happened was specific. Lauren had selected a program called P01, the pre-launch program. while the simulated spacecraft was already in the middle of a flight. P-01 was supposed to run only on the ground before launch. It initialized the navigation system from scratch. Running it mid-flight wiped out all the positional data the spacecraft was using to know where it was in space. For a 4-year-old, this was a fascinating cause and effect. For Hamilton, it was a problem. She went to her supervisors at MIT and at NASA and proposed adding code that would prevent an astronaut from selecting P-01 during a real flight. Lock the program out when it shouldn't be available. Block the input. Build a check. NASA said no. The reasoning is in the historical record. The astronauts were the most highly trained pilots in the world. They were not going to make a mistake like that. Adding software to protect them from an error they would never commit was unnecessary, used precious memory the spacecraft did not have to spare, and was, frankly, a little insulting to the men who would be flying the missions. Hamilton accepted the decision, but she did not let it go. What she did instead was add a single line of documentation to the program notes, a warning in plain English attached to the software. Do not select P-01 during flight. That was the official compromise. A note instead of a safeguard, a warning instead of a wall, and then Apollo 8 launched. Lovell hits the button. Apollo 8 was the second crewed Apollo mission and the first to leave Earth orbit. In December 1968, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first 3 humans to fly to the moon, orbit it, and come home. They did not land. The mission was a navigational dress rehearsal. 5 days into the flight, on the way back to Earth, Jim Lovell selected program P-01. He did exactly what Lauren Hamilton had done in that simulation a year earlier. He hit the button that wiped the navigation data. The Apollo guidance computer dutifully erased the spacecraft's knowledge of where it was, in deep space, 200,000 miles from home, with 3 astronauts inside. Stop and feel the weight of that for a moment. The most experienced pilot of his generation, on the most ambitious crewed spaceflight ever attempted up to that point, made the exact mistake that NASA had told Margaret Hamilton would never be made. He made it on the way back from the moon. Hamilton's team in Cambridge worked through the night with mission control to reconstruct the navigation data and re-upload it to the spacecraft manually. They got the crew home. The mission was a triumph publicly. Privately, inside the program, it was the moment the argument ended. When Hamilton walked into the next meeting and asked again whether she could add software to prevent astronauts from selecting P-01 during a flight, NASA said yes. That is how the safeguards got into the system. Not through a secret rogue code drop. Not through defiance. Through a 4-year-old, a Christmas mission, and a senior NASA pilot doing exactly what a senior NASA pilot was assured would never do. The pattern in that story is the pattern of Hamilton's whole career. She thought about the failure modes nobody else wanted to think about. She built protection against them. The institution often did not want the protection until the failure happened. And then they wanted it immediately. This is the part where most coverage of her loses the thread. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what comes next is the moment that changed not just Apollo, but every critical piece of software you depend on without knowing it. The priority displays. Hamilton's most important contribution to Apollo was not any single piece of code. It was a design philosophy. The Apollo guidance computer had to handle multiple tasks simultaneously, in a flight environment where conditions could change in milliseconds and where the consequences of getting it wrong were instant and total. Hamilton's team designed what they called an asynchronous executive, a system in which every job the computer needed to do was assigned a priority number, and the executive would decide in real time which jobs got computer time and which jobs would have to wait. This sounds simple now. In 1968, it was radical. Most computers of the era ran one task at a time. The job in front got all the resources. When the job was done, the next one started. If something more important came along, you had to stop the current job, save its state, switch to the new one, and hope nothing went wrong in the transition. Hamilton's executive did something different. It assumed that the world the spacecraft was operating in could change at any moment. It assumed that more jobs might suddenly need to run than the computer had cycles for. It assumed that the system needed to be able to choose, in flight, on its own, which jobs mattered most right now. Layered on top of that, she designed something called the priority display system. If the executive determined that something serious was happening, it could interrupt the astronauts' normal display screens with a priority alarm. The screen would show a code. The astronauts would relay the code to Mission Control. Mission Control would tell them whether to proceed or abort. The whole system was built on a philosophy Hamilton would later articulate cleanly. The software, the spacecraft, and the astronauts had to be able to talk to each other in real time, asynchronously, with the software capable of recognizing problems and showing them to the humans rather than hiding them. Man in the loop, she called it. The astronauts were not being replaced. They were being kept informed by software that knew when to ask for help. That entire architecture is the foundation of how reliable software works today. In aviation, in medicine, in finance, in every industry where computers and humans work together on time-critical problems. It came out of MIT's instrumentation laboratory in the 1960s, designed by a team of mostly women working in a discipline so new it did not have a name yet. Hamilton gave it a name. She started calling what she did software engineering. Hardware engineers had a discipline. Mechanical engineers had a discipline. Why didn't the people writing the code have one? She insisted on the term, and she used it consistently, and over time it stuck. The phrase you use now, software engineer, the title on millions of business cards, exists because Margaret Hamilton thought what she did deserved that level of respect, and she fought to get it. The 3 minutes, July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are inside the lunar module Eagle, descending toward the Sea of Tranquility. Mike Collins is in the command module Columbia, orbiting overhead. The descent is going perfectly. Then, 3 minutes before touchdown, the alarm fires. 12:02. The display on the cockpit panel shows the code, blinking. A few seconds later, 12:01. Armstrong calls it down to Mission Control. Give us a reading on the 12:02 program alarm. There is a long pause. Hundreds of engineers in Houston are looking at their consoles. Most of them have never seen a 12:02 alarm in a live mission. The training simulations had included alarms like this only once, weeks earlier, and the team had nearly aborted in that simulation as a result. Inside Mission Control, a 24-year-old NASA engineer named Jack Garman is sitting at a console with a handwritten list of every alarm code and what it means. He had made the list himself after the simulation that almost ended in an abort. 12:02 is on his list. So is 12:01. They both mean the same thing. Executive overflow. The computer is being asked to do more work than it can do at once. Garmin looks at the codes. He knows what they mean. He calls it up to his supervisor, Steve Bales. Bales calls it to flight director Gene Kranz. Kranz calls it to capsule communicator Charlie Duke. Duke calls it up to Armstrong. The whole chain takes seconds. Go on that alarm. Armstrong and Aldrin keep flying. The alarms continue to fire. The Eagle keeps descending. And the reason any of this works, the reason an executive overflow on a critical landing computer does not result in 2 dead astronauts on the surface of another world, is because of how Margaret Hamilton's team had designed the executive. Here is what was actually happening inside the computer in those 3 minutes. Before the descent began, the rendezvous radar switch had been left in the wrong position. This was a checklist error. The switch should have been in one position for the descent and a different position for the ascent. It was set wrong. As a result, the rendezvous radar, which was supposed to be off during the landing, was active. The radar was sending position data to the computer that the computer did not need and could not use, but it was using up processing cycles to receive and discard the data anyway. When the descent radar engaged at higher altitudes, the computer suddenly had 2 radar systems competing for attention, plus the navigation calculations, plus the engine control, plus the displays the astronauts were watching plus everything else the system was doing. The total load exceeded what the computer could process in real time. A 1960s computer with no protection against this would have crashed. The mission would have aborted, or worse. What Hamilton's executive did instead was exactly what it had been designed to do. It identified the lowest priority jobs in the queue, dropped them, restarted, and resumed the high priority jobs. The navigation continued. The engine control continued. The displays the astronauts needed for landing continued. The redundant work that the rendezvous radar was generating got dropped because the executive correctly identified it as not essential to the landing. The alarms the astronauts saw were the system telling them, honestly, in real time, that it was overloaded and was shedding lower priority work to keep going. That is exactly what the priority display system was for. The software was not hiding the problem, it was reporting it, and it kept reporting it again and again every few seconds as the load conditions repeated. Each time, the executive cleared the queue, prioritized the essential jobs, and continued. It worked. It worked because Hamilton and her team had spent years thinking about exactly this category of failure. They had designed for the case where the computer would be asked to do too much. They had built the recovery routines. They had tested them. And on the day it mattered, the system did what it was supposed to do. Armstrong took manual control in the final seconds because he wanted to fly the lander past a field of boulders he did not like the look of. The computer was still flying with him, still calculating, still showing him the data he needed. The two of them, the man and the machine, brought the Eagle down on a smooth patch of lunar ground with 17 seconds of fuel to spare. They walked on the moon. The world watched. And in Cambridge, Margaret Hamilton, who had been at mission control during the launch and had returned to MIT for the landing, watched her code do what she had built it to do on the most important day a piece of software had ever been asked to perform. Why you didn't hear her name for 30 years. This is the part of the story that is uncomfortable, and it is true. For decades, the public version of the Apollo 11 landing focused on the astronauts and the mission control team. Armstrong and Aldrin became household names. Gene Kranz became famous for the line, "Failure is not an option," which he never actually said during Apollo 11, but which was attributed to him by a movie. Even Jack Garman, the engineer with the handwritten alarm code list, got more public recognition for the 1202 alarm in the immediate aftermath than Hamilton did. The software was treated as background. The hardware got the attention. The astronauts were the heroes. Software in the public imagination was something that either worked or broke, and when it worked, it was invisible. The thousands of people who had spent years building the code that made the missions possible were rarely named in the coverage. This was not a deliberate cover-up. It was something more banal. Software was new. The public did not understand what it was. Reporters did not know how to write about it. The visible drama of the missions, the rockets, the launches, the men in suits was easy to photograph. The work happening inside the computers was abstract, and the people doing that work, including the team Hamilton led, which was substantially staffed by women, did not fit the cultural template of who got credit for engineering achievement in 1969. So Hamilton did her work, finished Apollo, founded a software company called Higher Order Software in 1976, founded another one called Hamilton Technologies in 1986, and continued working. She published over 130 papers. She kept developing the design principles she had pioneered on Apollo, and the world, mostly, did not know who she was. The recognition came slowly. In 1986, the Association for Women in Computing gave her the Augusta Ada Lovelace Award. In 2003, NASA gave her the Exceptional Space Act Award, which came with a check for $37,200, the largest individual award in the agency's history. In 2009, her alma mater, Earlham College, gave her an Outstanding Alumni Award. In 2016, President Barack Obama presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. He said, at the ceremony, 3 minutes before Armstrong and Aldrin touched down on the moon, Apollo 11's lunar lander alarm triggered, red and yellow lights across the board. Our astronauts didn't have much time, but thankfully, they had Margaret Hamilton. She was 80 years old when she received the medal. She had been waiting 47 years. The quieter legacy. The medals are not the legacy. The legacy is everywhere you cannot see it. The flight control software in every commercial airliner in the air right now uses descendants of the design principles Margaret Hamilton pioneered for Apollo. Asynchronous task scheduling, priority-based resource allocation, error detection and recovery, man-in-the-loop interfaces that keep the pilot informed of what the system is doing and why. These are not Hamilton's intellectual property. They are the intellectual common ground of the entire industry. But they came from somewhere. They came from a small team at MIT in the 1960s, working on a problem so urgent that they had to invent the solutions as they went. The same principles run inside hospital monitors, inside power grid management software, inside the trading systems on Wall Street, inside, increasingly, the autonomous systems that drive cars and fly drones and manage industrial robots. Anywhere software has to be reliable in real time, in conditions that can change without warning, on hardware with finite resources, you are looking at the descendants of what Hamilton's team built for the Eagle. She also gave the discipline its name, software engineering. 2 words. They sound obvious now. In 1969, they were a fight. Hamilton used the term deliberately, in meetings, in papers, in technical correspondence, until other people started using it too. She wanted what her team did to be taken as seriously as the work of the people designing the hardware. She knew that names mattered. Engineering is a discipline with standards and rigor and accountability. Software, before her, was often treated as a craft, sometimes as an art, occasionally as something closer to magic. By insisting on the word engineering, she insisted on something larger. That writing code to fly humans to the moon and back was not a side project. It was a discipline that needed its own methods, its own quality standards, its own respect. Every software engineer working today, every person whose business card or LinkedIn page uses that title, owes the language to her. Most of them have never heard her name. The stack go, look at the photograph. The young woman in a long dress standing next to a stack of paper taller than her. That is what writing the code that landed Apollo 11 looked like. Listings printed out, bound, lined up, months of debugging, years of design. A team of programmers, many of them women, working on a problem that had never been solved because nobody had ever needed to solve it before. The stack is the work. Every line in those volumes had to be right. Every decision about priority and timing and recovery had to anticipate failure modes that had never occurred in human history, because no human had ever been to the moon. Hamilton was 33. She had a young daughter. Her husband had finished law school and was building his own career. She was running a team of hundreds of engineers on the most ambitious software project ever attempted, and she was doing it in a discipline she was, in real time, helping to invent. When the alarms fired 3 minutes before the landing, she was watching from MIT, not Houston. She heard the codes called up. She knew immediately what they meant, because she had built the system that generated them. She knew the executive would do its job. She watched it do its job. And she did not get to walk into the cheering control room afterward, because that was not her room. She got to do something quieter. She got to know. That is the real Margaret Hamilton story. Not a secret, not a cover-up, not a rogue programmer defying NASA. A young woman with a 4-year-old daughter who saw a problem nobody else thought was a problem, who built the protections that almost nobody wanted built, who was right when everyone else was wrong, and who watched her code save the most important mission in the history of human exploration while standing in a lab in Cambridge, almost entirely unknown to the public, for the next 30 years. The recognition came late. The work was done on time. That is the version worth remembering. Not because it makes a better thumbnail than the conspiracy version, but because it is true and because the woman who actually did it deserves to be remembered for what she actually did. If this is the kind of story you came here for, real history, told carefully, about the people who made the modern world and didn't get the credit they should have at the time, subscribe. There are more where this one came from. The next person you have never heard of who quietly changed everything is already on the list. Margaret Hamilton is now 89 years old. She still gives interviews. She still talks about software engineering. She is still patient with reporters who ask her every time to retell the story of the 1202 alarm as if it were the only thing she ever did. It was not the only thing she ever did. It was the moment everyone else finally noticed what she had been doing all along.